Hi, class. Hope everyone's doing well. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about your work with on Gilgamesh from last week. So this will be kind of the last thing we do in terms of modeling the skill set that we're going to now be practicing the rest of the way through our film reports. So I just want to say a few things about that, and then we'll start with Pan's Labyrinth next week. We'll watch that and then start doing our analysis. So I'll give you kind of a free week just to watch the film of Pan's Labyrinth next week, and there'll be a video with me talking about that a little bit as well. And I don't know if I'll give you that before or after you submit your rough draft slash presentations. So when we do the class live, we do them as presentations, but doing them remotely, we usually just have you post your rough drafts and start a conversation from there. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Okay. So our two claims were about Gilgamesh as a hero, whether he fits the idea of a hero today or contradicts it, or whether it's a mixture of both, but more one or the other, and the other about how women are portrayed in that myth, in that story, and whether that shows that the status of women was better then or today. Okay, so I want to kind of touch on a few things about that. So I want to talk about the first one, whether he's a hero similar to our ideas of a hero today. So we can see certainly the ways he fits. I think is that he's male, he's strong. So we see that in a lot of our heroes today. All the superheroes of the comic book world, etc., usually have extraordinary strength and other things, right? And then very often we might say that increasingly our superheroes are smarter than they were 100 or so years ago, where it was just sort of the brawny but kind of stupid male, which is kind of what Gilgamesh is, right? Um, so that way, but it's maybe a little different, and we could see that in our culture today, we value the intellect, especially the intellect as defined by someone who's good at rational thought, which is the kind of knowledge we value in our own culture, right? Which isn't a which doesn't play much of a role in Gilgamesh's time. We don't see much value for rational thought in the age of Gilgamesh in this story. But even the knowledge that is valued, and I'll talk about that with the second claim in a little bit, is not necessarily something that Gilgamesh, the hero for this people, has. So that tells us something too, that maybe knowledge is just not as valued in general as it might be in our culture today, right? But the big question with Gilgamesh and whether he's a hero for today or not is the ethical question. And here's where I think he most doesn't fit our concepts of heroism today. So certainly we're seeing the ethical behavior of our heroes start to become more problematic. I forget. Um, I think it was Braxton, and I forget the hero you were mentioning. One of the um, um, Marvel heroes. I can see the actor, but I can't think anyway. We can see that. I think the other one I think about is Deadpool. So we can see certainly a more problematic ethical idea of a lot of heroes, and we can see that as a sort of a trend that it's not necessarily the norm. Most of our heroes are still the Superman, etc., the good guys who are always good in by our standards, etc. But I think even by this, even as we this trend kind of problematizes the ethics of our heroes, it's still quite a bit different from Gilgamesh. I can't imagine making a hero out of someone who starts off as a serial rapist, right? In our culture today, So for example, yeah, we can have a hero who's a partier and who has a lot of women, etc., because that's cool. That's part of the values of our culture. Even if ethically we sometimes question it, it makes you cool, right? But being a serial rapist does not make you cool, and that's what Gilgamesh was. So I think in that sense, the ethical is the big challenge here for our time, and says something. Says we've noticed two things in terms of interpreting cultural hegemony. We've noticed that in ancient Mesopotamia, they cared about knowledge a lot less than we do today, and that the type of knowledge they valued is quite a bit different, right? And the other thing I think we see is that they cared less about ethics, or at least as what we define as ethics, than we do today, right? So in order to make the argument that he is an ethical hero, and I think you're really have a tough time there because of the way it starts, right? But we could argue that he is a reformed hero, right? And that he fits, so he still fits because he reforms. He starts out really bad, but he reforms. And again, I think that is different, because I think, personally, I don't think that works because of the fact that we got someone who starts out as a serial rapist. Is we don't get that in our heroes today. We get heroes who are having a good time, who are a little egotistical or whatever, and then get humbled, but we don't have that extreme, right? But even so, I would argue further that I don't think Gilgamesh changes ethically by the way we see ethics after his encounter with Enkidu, which is the thing that's supposed to reform him. That's what the gods send to reform Gilgamesh and to get him to stop doing this. First of all, there's no mention that he actually does stop it. We just sort of presume that because that's what the whole point of Enkidu was, right? But then what does he do after he and Enkidu meet and fight and become best buddies, right? Well, the first thing they do is they go to the Humbaba, and the guardian of the cedar forest. And of course, that's not a hugely it is a pretty transparent metaphor for going and stealing somebody else's resources. In this case, cedar trees, which was the oil of that time, right? Which is a very important resource. So they went and stole it. And then I think we can't imagine we've got this God who's not done anything wrong other than try to protect his own property from being stolen, who's begging for his life, right? Can you imagine Batman? Batman, even when the Joker is begging him to kill him, says, "No, I will not kill you." But in this case, he's begging to be spared, and chops his head off and kills him, right? So I don't think that too doesn't fit with our ideas of heroism today. So if he's supposed to have reformed after Enkidu, we don't see evidence of it there, right? Then we could go on what happens after Enkidu dies. We could say, well, that's what humbled him. But if you think about it, what he did after that is he just tried to attain immortality for him, not for his friend Enkidu or for anyone else, for him, right? And he sets off and he gets some really good advice from the so-called bar wench, I think is how it was translated, right? To eat, drink, and be good to your wife was the gist of it. He ignores her and sets off on this quest, gets on the boat and destroys all the tackle. So he's not being a very, very hospitable. So nothing yet shows me that this is a very, ethical guy, right? He's violated the will of the gods in refusing to marry Ishtar, although we can kind of relate to that. But his reasoning seems pretty strong that, all Ishtar's husbands end up dead. But anyway, we see selfish behavior, right? And so, really, to make that argument, that it rests, I think, entirely on the ending of this story when he's given the plant of immortality, and he decides not, first and foremost, to eat it. He decides to give it to the elders first. So if you're making that argument, and nobody really went to that section. If we were in class, I would have forced you to. I tried to hint at it very strongly in my remarks. But that's where both sides need to look at that section and interpret that section in order to make your argument. And I think the side that's trying to make a case that he is a reformed and therefore ethical here at the end, is going to say, look, this is altruistic. He's thinking about the elders of his community. And then he goes back and they build this wall. He builds this wall for the community. So now he's doing stuff for the people, so to speak, instead of just for himself, right? Now, the other way, if you take it, he says, if you look at the actual language and if you quoted that, it can be read as if, I'm going to try it out on the elders first and then I'll take it. Could be like, is this safe? Why don't you try it first, right? It could be read that way as well, right? And then the latter part where he does build the walls, again, one side is going to argue, oh, see, altruism. He's doing the argument I just made, that he's doing this for the people. He's finally acting altruistically and not selfishly. The other side that's going to argue he really hasn't changed at all is going to say, look, he wanted immortality. He didn't get it. This is the consolation prize, right? The consolation prize is I'm going to make these walls that tell my story, and that will live on in forever. So in the year 2020, people will still be reading about me. So in other words, that's the consolation prize, is he can live on. His legacy can live on through art, through the walls and the imagery therein, and then the subsequent story, Epic of Gilgamesh, that we're now reading, one of the oldest stories of all time. So it could be read either way in that sense, right? So I think the ending of that story is critical, and then the argument you make for how to interpret that will determine whether we can make the case for him being ethical or reformed and now ethical or otherwise. As for the second question about the role of the status of women, remember, we're not talking about quality of life. Clearly, we have cars and other things that make everybody's lives a little easier today, maybe including women's, but it's in terms of status, right? And so if we look at all the female characters, right, starting with the harlot, right, which is how it's, translated, and then Gilgamesh's mother, Ishtar, right, and then Utnapishtim's wife, and the wench, the one that gives that advice. So the first thing I would note is that's why the knowledge question in this story, women are the holders of knowledge, and it's not rational knowledge that we prize today. It's sort of mythical knowledge. It's knowledge that comes via experience, and one of the dominant forms of knowledge is dreams and dream interpretation. And it's interesting because, for example, there are two people who do a lot of dream interpretation, right? One is Enkidu, and the other is Gilgamesh's mother. Enkidu is wrong every time, right? Dramatically wrong every time. But Gilgamesh's mother is right every time, right? And we can look at the whole thing with the harlot too and say, oh yeah, see, they're objectifying women. Not, I'm clearly in the case that women have more status, in the camp that women had more status then than they do today. Because one, that still takes place, objectification, all that. But two, it's not treated quite as objectification in that. She's a powerful person. She takes this wild man and civilizes him. Now, it's weird for us to think that, we're going to take this guy and get him a prostitute and feed him up and, have a lot of sex, and that will civilize him. So it's kind of counter to the ideas we have today of what civilized means. But it also suggests that there's a different understanding of sexuality and maybe the sacred at that time. And in fact, there was, again, harlots the way it's translated, but there was no such thing as a prostitute in this time, because this was not a money exchange economy. This was a gift exchange economy. So there could, everything went to the granaries, et cetera, and was produced for those purposes out after you produced for your own families, right? So it wasn't, no money was exchanged for this. What happened is that there were priestesses in the temples, and Herodotus, the Greek historian, writes about this, that in many cases that as a ritual for women, you had to go as a priestess in the temple to Artemis or Athena or whatever, and that someone would approach the temple, a male, and choose a priestess to engage with sexually, and that was a sacred act, and because you were a stand-in for the goddess herself when you did that, right? And that was the end of your service. So you were no longer a priestess, and with that came a loss of power because you could no longer represent the god, but also a certain freedom that came with it as well. And I think we see that here, and it's interesting because Enkidu curses her when he's about to die, and then immediately repents of it and says, and what he repents is, okay, yes, I lost all these wonderful things, my speed, my strength, etc. But what I gained was knowledge, right? And there we see this in the Bible, for example, and that's another Mesopotamian culture. Um, is that whole idea of so and so knew so and so, that sort of double entendre of the word know, implying sexual relations and knowledge. So, knowledge in this culture is experiential. It comes from dreams, it comes from experiences, etc. That's where we attain knowledge. And that also accounts for the reasons that Gilgamesh and Enkidu set off on their adventuring to gain knowledge through experience. And we can argue that he does gain some knowledge by the end, um, and whether that's ethical knowledge or whatever. But also, women have a knowledge of plants and other things. The other knowledge from the wench, when she gives Gilgamesh knowledge he probably should have taken, um, but doesn't. So Gilgamesh can't quite get it right throughout, and the males in the story seem to repeatedly miss out. Right now, at the same time, there's no question that there is a patriarchy at work here. Um, but the way I like to argue it is I use an anecdote of an experience with me and my nephew years ago. And when I was visiting back home, and my nephew wanted to play the Christmas game, which involved getting points for finding Christmas tree lights, right? And as we started to play, I would, no matter what lights I found, he found some technicality to dismiss me from getting any points. Meanwhile, he was getting points for car lights and stars and whatever, you know. So he won the game. And what I did is, oh gosh, you slugger, you good, you're just too good for me, darn it. And the reason I did that is because it wasn't a threat, because he's a little boy, right? I know I'm better than him. I'm stronger. I make more money. I'm, in whatever standard you choose in our society, I'm better. He's not a threat to me. So it's a sort of patronizing act to say, good job, you played the game better than me, right? So contrast that with, say, this documentary I once watched about these primitive cultures in New Guinea. And these two guys would go to different cultures. And in this one case, it was a culture that had a very clear division of labor between women and men. And one of the things that men did is they made fire. Women did not do that. And probably if the cameras weren't there, that it never would even have happened that a woman would start to make a fire. But on this particular occasion, it had been raining for like 3 weeks straight, and the men were having a tough time getting the fire ready. So the camera people said to the chief woman, "Hey, why don't you try it?" And she tried it, and boom, there was a fire. And the chief male of that tribe, just went ballistic, right? Like, oh yeah, I did all the work to dry the wood and so forth, and now you come along and do this. And he was just outraged. And my point is that his response is very different from mine and my nephew, because of the fact that his power in that tribe was really threatened by the fact that this woman just outdid him, right? And that's what I see in this story and a lot of the stories that we see in the so-called Neolithic mythology. Is you see the battle of the sexes. In later stories, that battle is over, right? The males won, and the males, by the time we get to the Greeks, it's pretty clear, the men are the reasons for creation, et cetera, and so on. But here, I think it's questioned, and the women are a real threat, um, as are primitive ways of life, such as those represented by Enkidu. We really have to argue for and try to make, no matter how irrationally, we have to try to make an argument for patriarchy in this time. Whereas I would argue that today we kind of, it, do some. We'll talk more about this when we get to the female divine and male divine later in the semester, and how which archetypes are valued in women today, versus in other periods of time and so forth, um, such as the warrior archetype and so forth. So I won't go into it and much more than that. Suffice this to say that I think today's culture still exists that kind of patronizing attitude of, oh, women are so good, etc., only because, as James Brown says, we know it's a man's world still, right? Um, and so anyway, that would be my my arguments on that claim there. And then again, we want to look closely at the different females. We can look at, one side can look at the harlot and make an argument case that, see, this is evidence that they didn't have it very, women had it worse off then. The other side can say, actually, this is evidence that they had it better off. This is a respected female, whereas prostitutes in our own time might not be so well respected, and vice versa. And I think on one hand, the group making the case that it represents that women have it much better today, they want to focus, I think, on Ishtar, because Ishtar, she comes across as a little bratty thing, and then she goes to daddy to remedy the situation. So that's the, I think, most negative portrayal of a woman in this story, right? Whereas I think, so on the other side, you want to look closely at Ishtar and try to rebut that, to say, hey, and the rebuttal might be, yeah, she is kind of bratty and so forth, but she's pretty powerful too. She's a goddess, and she's ultimately ends up getting Enkidu killed, right? So there's power there. And then the other is the argument I just made is, oh, okay, yeah, she is presented negatively. There is patriarchy here, but they're having to try really hard and have all kinds of tortured logic to make their case for patriarchy. And that's less necessary today, maybe we might argue, right? And the other side's going to focus on something like Gilgamesh's mother, who's always right, and then the Utnapishtim's wife, who has the knowledge of the plant of immortality that's given to Gilgamesh, the winch. So there's, you look at those and the positive portrayals therein. Okay. So anyway, uh, um, that's it for again our practice on this. I will give you the instructions for how we'll do our presentations for our film reports the rest of the way. And your assignment for this week is simply going to be to watch this video lecture. If you have any comments you want to make, you can leave them below in the comments section, or shoot me an email if you have a question about something. And so the assignment for this week is just to watch Pan's Labyrinth. And again, read the instructions for film report number 1. And one thing I want to make a case for is, don't try to answer everything in the prompt, because there's way too much there to write a 2 to 5 page paper, right? If you want to write a book, try to answer everything. Single out something that use that prompt to single something out that you want to respond to. It's also okay to go a completely different direction, as long as you're interpreting the cultural hegemony of the culture that produced that film. And that's, in this case, America. I think the film was made in 2007, right? And that's interesting because it is a film made for Hollywood, made for an American audience, but it's in Spanish by a Mexican film director about things that happened in Spain. So there's all kinds of internationalism going on there. And I'll put out a video. It's actually one I made last semester. I'll let you take a look at that to get some other ideas about how to respond to Pan's Labyrinth in following the instructions. So enjoy, go buy yourself some popcorn, and enjoy the film this week. I can't remember. I haven't checked yet to see if it's still available on Netflix. It was last semester. If not, the library is another good free way to get your hands on that. And I'm not sure about other streaming services, if it's available there too. But that's one that's usually been pretty easy to find by students in the past. So hopefully you can find it for free. And at the worst case scenarios, you'll have to spend, I think, like $3 to get it on YouTube or Amazon Prime or something. So okay, everyone. Like I said, shoot me an email with questions and so on. And hope you all have a good week. Bye.